Hi, my name is Matthew Jensen, a service technician with RapidView, and today we're going to be covering the union connection retermination of a pushrod cable. The union connection is the section of the pushrod cable that allows you to disconnect the hard tube section of the cable from the soft tube section. This is good if you need to change out the rigidity of the hard tube section, or if you have a damaged section of the cable and then you can just quickly switch it out. It connects together just like any other plug. You screw them together and then they're good to go. The pushrod cable has a union connection between the soft cable and the pushrod section. And if you have an MP4 cable, you are also going to have the spring connection at the front. For the retermination, the following tools you'll need are a ruler, a marker, tweezers, heat shrink, utility knife, wire cutters, wire strippers, Kevlar scissors, a T6 screwdriver, solder, flux, 1-to-1 epoxy, paper towel, and 2 vices. Before we get started, you want to make sure that you have the right pieces depending on which side of the union connection you're going to be reterminating. For the front end and the hard tube, you'll have the boot, the wear protection, the outer cover, and the plug, along with 2 O-rings for the plug and 1 O-ring for the outer cover. There's also going to be 3 grub screws that hold these together. For the rear of the cable, you're going to have the same boot and the same O-ring that go inside the housing. You're also going to have a locking nut, additional O-ring, and the front plug. For both housings, there's going to be a small O-ring that go inside the housing and around the cable. Make sure that you put this O-ring in first before you put the housing over the cable. Inside, there's a small groove that the O-ring will fit into. Once we have our O-ring inside the housing for both the front and the back of the cable, and our O-rings on our plug, go ahead and put your pieces on the cable in the order of the boot first, and then there's going to be a wear protection, and at the front of the wear protection is a little ridge that lines up here, then the housing goes on. And for the back of the cable, you'll have your boot, your locking nut, and your housing. The retermination can be performed on one or both sides of the union connection as needed. On both cases, you'll be measuring approximately 15 millimeters, between 10 and 15 millimeters, and stripping the cable back. Mark 15 millimeters. Take a utility knife and be careful to cut through the jacket of the cable without damaging the Kevlar or the wires beneath it. The remaining Kevlar can be cut back to approximately 4 or 5 millimeters. And beneath the Kevlar is a white covering paper that can just be removed, along with the extra string that gives it a little pulling power. Beneath the Kevlar, you have your bundle of wires with your coax cable in the center. Take a piece of heat shrink, press down on the Kevlar to get it out of the way. And then pull back your wires to get to the coax cable. On the outside of the coax cable is a plastic sheath covering. Take your utility knife and lightly score that covering along the bottom to remove it. Next, you'll take the shield of the coax cable and carefully unbraid it. Separate it into two sections and twist each section so that it can wrap around the base of the coax. Once you have it separated into two sections, twist it around the base. You're not going to use the full length of the copper shield. Approximately 1.5 to 2 twists is all you need, and then you can cut off the excess. Now that I have my vise set up, I also reposition the heat shrink to cover the extra wires. I'm going to take a little bit of flux and cover the coax shield so that the solder will soak into it and make a nice bead around it. Once we have our flux on, I will carefully put some solder on the shield of the coax cable to hold down all the frayed wires and to allow me to solder on an additional wire to make our connection for our video. Once we have our bead around the coax cable, we'll cut off between 3 and 5 millimeters from the top to allow us to get to the center conductor of the coax cable. I'm using tweezers and a utility knife to allow me to cut into the insulating separator without getting too close to the shield, leaving a space between. And then I will tin the end of that with some more solder. After we get our bead around the coax shield and the bead on top of the coax conductor, we can go ahead and pull our wires back out and strip the ends of these and tin them for our solder connections. Next, we'll take a length of black and white wire to solder onto our coax cable. The black will be used as the shield and the white will be used as the conductor. Carefully solder on the black wire to the coax shield without melting through the insulator to the coax conductor. And then you can solder the white wire onto the coax conductor. Take a small piece of heat shrink and use it to cover up both the shield and the conductor. Use an air gun to shrink the heat shrink down, but make sure not to apply so much heat that you melt through that insulator. When performing this retermination, regardless of which side of the cable you're reterminating, both sides are going to be prepared the same way. You're going to cut your wires to length, strip them, and tin them the same. Then you're going to tin the solder points of the plugs that you'll be using. When soldering, you're going to have this connection will be for the front of the cable, and this connection will be for the rear of the cable. You can see on this wiring diagram that pin number 2 is for a pink wire. Some of the cables for pushrod cables will have an additional pink wire. If yours doesn't have this pink wire, you can ignore pin number 2 and solder everything else. Once we have both of our plugs soldered, notice that pin number 2 is not filled. They're going to be mirrored from each other. Now we're ready to start soldering our wires onto our plug. When you do this, make sure you start with the center pins first so that you can get to the outer pins easier. And that completes the soldering on the front portion of the pushrod cable. When you're soldering on the smaller plug, be careful not to bridge any of the connections. They're very close together and the pins are not all that long. this completes soldering of the rear section of the pushrod cable. When you're doing your retermination, if you're going to reterminate both sides, get up to this point before you pour any epoxy. And then make sure that everything fits together. And on the soft cable side, there's going to be 2 notches that are on the housing, and you want to make sure that they line up different sizes to the other plug. So place those together and make sure that the small notch goes on the small side and the large notch goes on the large side. And this will be your orientation for when you pour your epoxy. You want to make sure that this groove that's in the plug lines up with the smaller notch. You can also remove the heat shrink. Push the housing of each side close to the plug and giving you enough room to pour in your epoxy. We'll be using a 1-to-1 5-minute set epoxy, but after you pour the epoxy, you want to make sure you let it set for about an hour before you really work with anything. Attaching the mixer nozzle to the epoxy. I have an applicator tip so I can get into these small areas. I'll pour a small amount of epoxy off to the side to make sure it's adequately mixed. And first, I'll pour into the front connection. And you want to fill this up as much as you can. Get it to the point so that when you push everything together, epoxy squeezes out of the sides. You don't want there to be any air gaps. And you also want it to mix up with the exposed Kevlar as best you can. When you press the plug into the housing, make sure that you're mostly pushing the housing up to the plug without pulling on any of the soldered wires. There's a notch in the plug and a hole in the housing for your grub screws to line up in. Press the plug into the housing and set one grub screw to lock it in place. The other 3 screws can be put in after you get the other side done. For the saw section of the cable, once you press it into place, go ahead and put it in the notch of the hard section of the tube. This will ensure that the notch, that this groove on our plug will line up to the center of the smaller notch here. And then take our locking nut and lock it into place. This will hold everything into place in the right orientation as the epoxy hardens. After you've given your epoxy time to set, go ahead and put the rest of your connections together. The wear sleeve will go over the front part of the connection and it lines up with a groove there. This will help protect the metal from being worn down. And then go ahead and place your boots on either side. And this will complete the retermination of the union connection.